Welcome back, everybody, to another RoboTaxi Report. I've got another week of data on 10.8.1, making that the 5th consecutive week on the same software stack. That being said, I've got a lot of new information to show you today. I'm trying to streamline my process by familiarizing myself with Excel and other ways to present these graphs. I apologize in advance if anything is a little counterintuitive, but I'll do my best to explain as we go. Let's jump on into the RoboTaxi results, looking at 5 weeks of data. I don't have a lot to talk about here, given the previous 4 episodes covering the same thing. But just to clarify, a successful trip requires 0 disengagements, because a RoboTaxi without a driver needs to be able to get the person from pickup to drop-off. You can see this last week just adding to the consistency of 10.8.1. And as we look at the overall total at the very bottom, you'll see we're approaching 300 trips with right about a 50-50 success to fail ratio. I find looking at these 5 weeks of information coming down to a near 50-50 split to be extremely fascinating. Before I started collecting this information, I would have predicted far more failure than you're seeing here. When considering a future with robotaxis or autonomous transportation, a 50-50 ratio is nowhere near the operational reliability that we're aiming for. Moving forward, this is an example of the new information that I have for you this week. From February 7 to February 13, I've started to include interventions as well as disengagement. Now keep in mind here, more is better. So the larger bar indicates better success or better performance. And in the top left, we have the pretty familiar kilometers per disengagement looking at simple versus critical. Simple being navigationally related or something that is non-threatening, and critical being dangerous, major legal issue or oncoming traffic or super excessive speeding, things that could lead to injury, death, damage, that sort of thing. And that remains pretty consistent as related to previous weeks. But below that, now we have a look at intervention. In the last episode, I explained that I'd be very picky about the interventions that actually count or matter. And there are 2 types of interventions that really stand out as a limiting factor. And that is when a car gets completely stuck and you're forced to apply the throttle to get it moving, and when the vehicle, for whatever reason, decides it wants to change lanes, which is going to then cause it to either miss an exit, miss a turn, or cause an issue of some sort. So here you can see that it's a lot more often that you're going to have to throttle than cancel a lane change. But it's still rather interesting that between both data points throughout the week, to the far right, you can see it's almost a 50-50 split between disengagements and interventions. Interventions, as you would imagine, are a bit more common than disengagements. That's reflected in 32 kilometers per intervention versus 36 kilometers per disengagement. But this provides a more thorough view of what's actually going on in regard to beta tester interacting with the beta itself. Now, this next portion is covering city disengagements versus highway disengagements. And since I only have 1 week of data, what I did is I broke down the entire week from 7 February to 13 February. As you can see, orange is highway and city is in blue, and these are total disengagements. So we're not breaking down simple versus critical. This is just total disengagements throughout the week split between city and highway. And in this case as well, more is better. One thing that I found interesting when looking at this graph after I plotted the points is that the highway has no consistency at all over this last week. And I've expressed agitation with the performance of the public or highway build. Most critical disengagements I feel tend to take place on the highway, where you get the forced red hands, red steering wheel, the loud alerts, and more often than not issues with high speed. It's more dangerous than you would find at city speeds. It'll be interesting to see this week over week so we can get an actual idea of how the system's performing long term and maybe look at some trend lines. It would be nice to see if there's any actual consistency to the highway performance or if it's just all over the place, whereas the city side seems to be a bit more consistent. February 8th was just a good day overall, kind of a lucky one. I would consider it an outlier because I had 0 disengagements for city or highway, and that's another reason that it's good to see this week over week, because you can take these 7 points and average them out and then compare that to each subsequent week to come, and that gets rid of a lot of the really crazy outliers and the points of the data that just kind of skew your perspective. I'm using this graph to show that I am taking feedback from the comments and planning to implement it in the future. That way we can see different metrics and just more information overall over time. This was my first actual graph made on Excel, so I plan to get better and more familiar with how Excel operates. It might come as a surprise that I have not used Excel up to this point. Everything's been pen and paper and then kind of trying to use what apps I can to create the graphs for you. But I'm enjoying the learning process, and I love that I can make this better. Next, we're going to take a look at critical disengagements over 500 kilometers, and I mostly just want to show you this since we're still in the same software stack, doing exactly what we would expect. So last week, which is the one in the top left that's kind of squished in there, you can see that the original first week at 3.14 disengagements per 500 kilometers, and then cumulatively on the right was 2.36. Well, now this larger graph at the bottom that looks more like a flat line is that first week and cumulatively again all the way to the 13th. And you'll see that it's starting to flatten out. It's getting closer to that 3 mark, which is what you would expect, again, on a single sample size. As you get more information, it's going to kind of level out and perform consistently, at least if you're recording your information properly. Again, this just shows that I'm consistent in my recordings. And then we can take this against future updates, if and when those ever happen, and actually see a change over time. Hopefully towards the 0 or down. That's what we want to see. And getting close to wrapping it up here, we're going to take a look at another bundle of new information. So last week I mentioned that I wanted to take a look at causation. And specifically what I mean by causation is what is causing the disengagements in particular. This donut graph is a lot of crammed colors, but you can see on the left all of the categories that I've labeled for reasons that I've had to disengage, whether it's city or highway, simple or critical. As one would probably expect, and frankly a bit surprising just how much, 68% of it is navigational issues. And this is just where the vehicle makes improper lane moves, misses turns, or gets on the wrong road, or just does something in its navigational operation that just makes you have to take over because it just can't do whatever it's trying to do. Another case would be like U-turns, for example, because the car actually cannot execute that maneuver. When it comes to robotaxi trips, for example, that have a U-turn, I count it as a failure. The car cannot do it. And some people might have opinions about that or whether that's fair or not, but as it stands right now, the car cannot do it. So that's a limiting factor. That's a failure. Moving down the list, I tried to put it in order of most impactful causation to least. And we can see that construction is right under navigation, topping out the rest of the 9 items. Construction should be pretty self-explanatory. That's just anytime the vehicle messes up around any form of construction. Legal is a pretty important issue that is separate from speed, and I'll explain why. So on the legal standpoint, I'm thinking of running red lights or of getting into the improper lane, like oncoming traffic, as well as excessive speeding when the vehicle does not realize that the speed limit has changed and you have to take over because you're going way too fast. If any of you saw one of my recent customer reactions video, there's a pretty funny part where I'm trying to toggle down on the scroll wheel to slow the vehicle down and I can't do it fast enough, so I had to take over. The speed limit on that road was about 70 kilometers an hour, and the car had not registered the change from the highway and was trying to get up to 115 kilometers an hour. For all of you Freedom Units lovers, that's about 35-40 miles an hour that you're supposed to go in an area where it's trying to go about 70. Another small but important legal issue is the fact that the car can't properly not turn on red. So when you have a sign that says just that, you have to take over, or the car is going to try to execute a right on red. Going down to red wheel, that should be obvious. That's the scary red wheel, the red hands, and the loud alarm that comes on whenever the system has to force you out of autopilot and you have to take over. This predominantly happens to me on the highway. It's happened quite a bit in the Friars Challenge, and it will spontaneously happen every now and then on highway interchanges when you're going from one highway to another. I'm not exactly sure what the cause is. There has to be some sort of internal freakout. But regardless, it's a pretty critical disengagement because it forces you out entirely. Now, speed I have separate from legal because there are cases where it's not a legal issue, but it is an excessive speed issue that's a safety concern. The biggest example that I can bring to attention is, again, from the Friars Challenge when it would get to the wrong exit and then it needs to wrap around an exit, an on-ramp, if you will, that's, a safe 50 kilometer an hour turn, and the car flies in at 90 with no showing of slowing down. That's a point where you got to take over, or you might go off the road. And in that case, about a 40 to 50 meter drop to follow. So while critical, I don't consider that to be in the same category as legal every time, because sometimes you're just going a little too fast in certain areas, and it might not be as extreme as the example I gave. It could just be that you're coming into a right or left turn, and you feel like you're just going way too fast. It's just uncomfortable and you need to take over. For me, that can be common if I have customers, because I will not put them in a risky situation. Safety and comfort first. Human is basically anything that involves another human driver or pedestrian or just an example of a human that's going to cause an issue and you have to take over. It should be no surprise that humans are horrible drivers and don't really know how to walk very well either. So the human category, surprisingly not as big as I would have expected, but that's what that's going to cover. Buses are pretty much any time that you're behind a bus or near a bus and it comes to a bus stop and the car messes up. It either wants to jump into the lane to the left, even though there's a car there, or it gets stuck, or it doesn't properly execute a maneuver around the bus. Road hazard should be self-explanatory, just objects in the road the car doesn't see, potholes and such, ladders, buckets, anything you can imagine falling out of the back of someone's truck. And then roadside has to deal a lot with emergency vehicles that may be on the shoulder of the highway. The one case that came to mind where I had to take over was a tow truck that was partially in the far right lane and the shoulder, and I had a customer with me, so I wasn't gonna take the chance of seeing if the car would move over properly. I just took over and changed lanes myself. But roadside pretty much fits the category of any vehicle stopped to provide aid, or just is on the shoulder, or taking up space where you other words need to go around safely, and the car may or may not execute that properly. Admittedly, this looks like a bit of a jumbled mess, but this is my first iteration on the causation factor of what's causing these disengagements. Let me know what you guys think. I thought it was kind of cool to see what the culprit is when it comes to the vehicle, and predominantly, majority, bar none, is just basic navigational and functional issues. And finally, as we wrap up this episode, I want to take a look at what I would consider common issues and largely game-breaking issues, which if you're a gamer or in the gaming world, it just means there's a bug that's so bad that the game is barely playable or not playable at all. And by game in this case, I mean a fully functioning autonomous vehicle to the point where it can be used as a robotaxi. Right now, as I'm sure most of you have experienced, the car is still very bad when it comes to turning right at a light or a stop sign or anywhere where there's not a complete and fully marked right turning lane. Typically, it's a bike lane hybrid or a partial turn lane with dotted lines, and the car sometimes will start to get in that lane and then freak out and swing back out to the left, staying in its original lane, which then puts you in that awkward situation where you have humans coming in on the right side, doing what you would have done, and now your car needs to turn right, but you got a line of cars that are already doing that next to you. So, very frustrating, and pretty much a guaranteed failure in a robotaxi scenario. Otherwise, you're waiting and trying to see if there will be a point where the car can actually get over, but you can see where this would cause a lot of unnecessary risk. The next one, jumping into bus lanes. Now, this one is very aggravating for me. We have a street pretty close to where I live where the entire right side, for the full length of the street, El Cajon Boulevard, if you're familiar, is just one big bus lane. And every time, without fail, the vehicle jumps in and wants to stay in the bus lane. It does not know how to register the difference between regular traffic and bus lanes, and that is an obvious problem that needs to be addressed. As mentioned with the causation, just recapping that autopilot behind a bus as it's coming to a stop to pick people up, this can be a big problem because it just has a momentary freak out and is not consistent about safely getting around the bus without wanting to jump into the left lane, into other cars. Hopefully in the future the system will be able to identify when a bus is coming to a stop to pick up passengers and just get into the other lane preemptively, or similar to how it does with navigating routes, just if it's behind a bus or a large vehicle, if you've got plenty of time before your next turn, it's probably good to just have it to where the program gets out of that lane. Just get out from behind whatever vehicle that is, and I could see that eliminating a lot of those issues. And the next one is one of the biggest causes for a failure when it comes to robotaxi trips or just basic navigational issue, and it's the fact that the car, for whatever reason, very close to an immediate turn it needs to make, will change lanes further away from the turn lane. To try to explain this better, imagine you're in the far left lane, coming to a light to turn left, but there's a car in front of you, and your car decides it wants to get into the right lane to go around that car, but you know now you're going to miss that left turn. That is this problem, and it is all too common. I'm sure some of you are probably nodding your heads having this exact same issue with your beta car. It's really funny. I know that there's a conflict there between trying to utilize speed-based lane changing while also planning for the navigation, but there needs to be, I think, to be more priority on the navigation, less on getting around the car in front of you. There's a lot of times when even just sitting at a light or a stop, the car will seemingly get impatient because, yes, it's a machine, and it'll want to change lanes, whether it's going into the wrong lane or sometimes going into a median or a shoulder. It just, for whatever reason, does not want to be stuck behind the car in front of it. Now, the last one, this is pretty bad. I don't know if you guys experienced this. I have experienced it a few times. You get to a red light, and it's a solid red light, and on the screen, on your actual display, you can see that that red light is flashing. If that's the case, your car is going to interpret that red light as a four-way stop, as if it was flashing. That is when you have to be ready to take over. There's been at least twice this last week when coming up to a red light, I get freaked out because all of a sudden my car starts to move and I have to hit the brakes and stop it and disengage. And then I look down at my display and I see the red lights actually flashing on and off. And then I look up and see the actual light is not. And I find myself double checking my sanity for a moment. I don't know what's causing the issue, but it is one that is all too frequent. Twice in 1 week. I'd say that's pretty bad. But these are all the common issues, the big ones that I could think of in my day-to-day use. I would love to know any more you might have. Just add it in the comments. Let me know. Maybe I can compile a list of game-breaking issues, of bugs that need to be patched out of the system. So let me know what you think. I've got some things working in the background that I hope to incorporate in the future to make this even better, but I don't want to give away anything yet. I've also taken several steps to make sure that my vehicle isn't blocked from software. I've had Tesla diagnose my software connection, even completely clean out my memory cache from almost 200,000 kilometers of driving. I also took the step that was recommended by another viewer to disconnect my car from Tesla and change my Tesla password to see if maybe that'll move it forward for me and I can finally get an update. I've sent several emails to the FSD Beta team, but I haven't gotten anything back. I imagine they are busy as hell, so I'm not really holding it against them that they haven't gotten back to me. I'm just one guy out of 60,000 beta testers, maybe more by now. There may be a good chance that those of us that are still on 10.8.1 are just going to have to wait till version 11 to the big stack change. There's a lot going on with the software team, and I imagine version 11 is a big deal. And when that hits, I would hope that it would go to all of us pretty quickly, because those of us not on version 11 would be quite obsolete. But thank you for your time and for the view. Again, give me all the suggestions you can. Give me all the feedback. I love it. You guys take care, and I will catch you in the next video.